Something has gone terribly wrong for an entire generation, but hardly anyone can articulate why. Millennials were raised to believe they would inherit the wealthiest nation in human history, a country where hard work guaranteed upward mobility, and education was the golden ticket to success. Instead, they entered adulthood only to find the ladder missing half its rungs, the rules rewritten, and the dream they were promised quietly slipping out of reach. It is not a coincidence. For millennials, crisis has never been a moment in time, it has been the backdrop of their entire lives. What if the story you've been told about millennials being lazy or irresponsible was a complete lie? What if the reality is far more unsettling? What if this generation never had a chance, not because of individual choices, but because they were born at the precise moment when the world's financial engine began a violent, generational shift that no one warned them about? Millennials grew up in the glow of the 1990s prosperity myth, the dot-com boom, record stock market highs, the illusion of stability after the Cold War. Everything suggested a future of limitless opportunity. Their parents, raised in a post-war economic supernova, told them success was simple: study hard, earn a degree, get a job, buy a home, start a family. It was presented like a checklist, a recipe guaranteed to work because it had worked before. But beneath the surface, the machinery of the global economy was already beginning to fracture. Wages had stopped rising in the 1970s, housing affordability had quietly deteriorated for decades, and the financial sector was consuming a larger share of national wealth every year. Millennials were told to prepare for a world that no longer existed, and the people giving the advice didn't realize the ground had already shifted beneath their feet. Then came the morning that changed everything. The September 11th attacks didn't just shatter buildings, they shattered the economic trajectory millennials expected to inherit. Suddenly, the job market they were preparing to enter froze. Travel collapsed. Entire industries panicked, and a generation on the verge of adulthood stepped directly into uncertainty. The fear and instability that followed 9/11s became the psychological baseline for millions of young people, conditioning them to expect crisis as normal. But here's the part no one talks about: 9/11s was only the opening chapter. It was the first in a chain of economic aftershocks that millennials would endure again and again. Every time this generation tried to stand up, another blow arrived, harder than the last. And each one wasn't random, they were symptoms of a financial system entering a new and dangerous era. The Great Recession hit exactly when millennials reached working age. COVID-19 hit when they were finally recovering. Inflation hit when they were trying to build families. A disruption hit just as they sought job stability. Housing prices soared every time they saved for a down payment. Every major milestone in life has collided with a crisis that wiped out the progress they'd made. You could call it bad luck, or you could recognize the pattern for what it is: a generational trap engineered by decades of economic policy shifts, financialization, globalization, and systematic wealth extraction. Millennials aren't failing, they're surviving a system that was already burning by the time they stepped into it. And if you're a millennial watching this right now, here's the question you need to ask yourself: how is it possible that every major global crisis of the last 25 years has hit your generation at the exact moment it hurts the most? Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below, and if you want the unfiltered truth about why this keeps happening, make sure you subscribe. Because once you understand the pattern, you'll never see your own life the same way again. To understand why millennials keep getting crushed under one economic disaster after another, we have to zoom out not just to the 1990s, not just to 2008, but generations earlier. Because the story of millennial struggle didn't start with millennials at all. It began long before they were born, during a slow-burn transformation of the American economy that their parents never saw coming. Millennials grew up hearing stories about the golden age, a time when a single income could support a family, when a modest house cost 2 or 3 years of salary, when jobs were stable, pensions were common, and college tuition was something students could pay off by working a part-time summer job. None of this was normal. It was a historical anomaly created by a very specific moment in time. America as post-World War II economic dominance. Europe was rebuilding, Japan was recovering, global competition was minimal. Wages rose alongside productivity, and the United States controlled most of the world's industrial output. Boomers grew up inside a window of prosperity that had more to do with geopolitics than with personal virtue. Just work hard and you'll be fine, they said. But by the time millennials came along, the world had changed. The American economy had undergone a quiet metamorphosis starting in the 1970s. One that shifted power from workers to corporations, from wages to profits, and from production to financial speculation. The shift explains nearly everything that millennials would later face. In the early 1980s, wages began decoupling from productivity. For almost a century, When workers produced more, they earned more. But suddenly corporate profits soared while paychecks stagnated. Households compensated by sending more family members into the workforce, with women entering the labor market in unprecedented numbers. Then they compensated again by relying on credit cards and home equity loans. And finally, when even that wasn't enough, millennials were told the only path remaining was to take on enormous student debt, to compete in a labor market that no longer rewarded loyalty or longevity. Sound familiar? By the time millennials entered school, this pressure cooker had already reached a boiling point. College wasn't simply encouraged, it was mandatory for survival. But tuition had exploded hundreds of percent faster than wages, and the federal government had quietly shifted responsibility for higher education onto students and families, creating a generation that began adulthood with the largest debt burden in modern history. When boomers graduated, their average student debt was effectively zero. Millennials entered the job market owing tens of thousands before earning their first paycheck. Sound familiar? Through the 1990s, millennials lived in a world that felt invincible. The United States had won the Cold War. Technology was booming. The stock market hit historic highs. Parents told their kids they could be anything, do anything, achieve anything. But beneath that optimism, the foundation of the economy was hollowing out. Manufacturing jobs were disappearing. Industries were automated or outsourced. The financial sector ballooned. Corporate mergers skyrocketed. Housing became an investment vehicle instead of a basic human need. And Wall Street increasingly made money not by creating value but by engineering debt. Sound familiar? Then came the moment that defined a generation. The September 11th attacks shocked the nation out of its illusion of stability. The global economy seized. Airports shut down. Corporations froze. Hiring. Millennials watched the world they thought they would inherit collapse before they ever had a chance to participate in it. Suddenly, the security they believed was guaranteed evaporated. And even though America recovered, millennials stepped into adulthood with a new psychological baseline: instability. But they didn't yet know that instability would become the theme of their entire lives. As the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on, the economy limped forward. But the recovery was more fragile than anyone knew. A financial bomb was ticking beneath the surface, created by the very institutions that had been deregulated and empowered decades earlier. Millennials were told to go to college and get degrees to prepare for a world where white-collar stability was still possible. But just as the oldest among them walked across the graduation stage, the global financial system imploded. The 2008 crisis wasn't just an event, it was a generational dividing line. Everything that came before it, the promises, the expectations, the belief that economic progress was linear, died in that moment. Millennials entered adulthood during the worst job market in modern history. Degrees lose value when employers vanish. Internships become the new entry-level jobs. And entire industries stop hiring for years at a time. Boomers had been building houses in their 20s. Millennials were moving back in with their parents. And then the strangest part happened. The world told them this was their fault, as if the timing of their birth wasn't the most catastrophic economic coincidence imaginable. The recovery that followed was not a recovery in the traditional sense. It was a financial recovery, not a human one. Asset prices returned. Corporate profits boomed. Wall Street rose, but wages stayed flat. Housing became even less affordable. Renting became a permanent lifestyle. And instead of building wealth, millennials built survival strategies. Gig work replaced stable employment. Side hustles replaced career ladders. And financial uncertainty became the air millennials breathed. By the time COVID hit, millennials were already exhausted. They were finally gaining traction when another crisis, another once-in-a-century shock destroyed whatever momentum they had left. Every milestone delayed by the Great Recession was delayed again. And the inflation crisis that followed wiped out the limited savings they'd managed to rebuild. Once again, it all sounds familiar. Millennials were not just unlucky. They were born into the first generation in modern history to experience for economic crises before turning 40, each one hitting them at the exact developmental moment it would cause the most damage. This isn't coincidence. It's structural. It's the story of an economic system that shifted from stability to volatility, from opportunity to precarity, from building wealth to extracting it. And millennials became the collateral damage of that transformation. What if everything millennials have experienced, the delayed milestones, the shrinking opportunities, the constant economic instability, was not simply a chain of unfortunate events? What if there was a deeper mechanism at work, a systemic engine quietly reshaping the economy in ways that guaranteed millennials would be the ones crushed by every shockwave? Up until now, the narrative surrounding millennials has been built on visible crises: 9/11s, the Great Recession, COVID-19, inflation. But none of those events explain why this generation keeps taking the hardest hits. Why did every major economic collapse land precisely at the worst possible moment for millennials? Why did the so-called recoveries never restore the opportunities that existed before? Why does it feel like the ground millennials stand on is constantly shifting, even during good times? Because beneath all the headlines, beneath all the political arguments, there is one force that defines this entire story. A force so enormous and so invisible that most people never think about it, even though it silently controls everything from wages to housing prices to student debt to job security. That force is financialization. The United States economy didn't simply evolve over time, it was re-engineered. For decades, quietly and systematically, the economy shifted from one that created value through production to one that extracted value through debt, speculation, and asset inflation. This wasn't a conspiracy in the shadows, it was a transformation carried out in boardrooms, policy-making institutions, and academic circles, championed as efficiency, innovation, and modernization. And millennials were the first generation to enter adulthood after the transformation was complete. Financialization meant that homes weren't just homes, they were investment vehicles. Students weren't future workers, they were revenue streams for lenders. Jobs weren't long-term commitments, they were line items to be optimized or automated. Retirements weren't pensions, they were volatile for 101k accounts tied to market performance. Healthcare wasn't a public good, it was a trillion-dollar industry dependent on rising prices. In a financialized economy, stability is unprofitable. Volatility is opportunity. Crises are moments for consolidation. Growth increasingly comes not from producing things, but from owning things. Millennials entered adulthood owning nothing. The twist is this: the generations before them built wealth by participating in an economy that rewarded labor, stability, and long-term employment. Millennials entered a system that rewarded institutions for debt creation, risk-taking, and asset hoarding. The rules changed, and no one told the people born after 1980. This is why every crisis felt like déjà vu. The same pattern repeated again and again. A crisis hits, gives millennials lose jobs, gives asset prices temporarily fall, gives wealthy institutions buy everything, gives asset prices rise even higher, gives millennials are shut out again. Sound familiar? But here's the part that truly changes the story. Millennials weren't just hit harder, they were hit strategically, because they were the generation with the least accumulated wealth and the most exposure to debt. Every systemic shock transferred wealth upward, away from those just starting out and toward those who already owned assets. This is why boomers could buy homes for $30,000 and millennials. And now another shift is emerging: AI, automation, and the gig economy restructuring the meaning of work itself. The millennial crisis cycle isn't ending, it's accelerating. But we still haven't addressed the real bombshell. Financialization didn't appear out of nowhere. It wasn't an accident. It was released into the economy through a set of deliberate political and economic decisions made between the 1970s and early 2000s, decisions that created the system millennials were forced to enter. These decisions weren't made by accident. They weren't made in isolation, and they weren't made without winners and losers. The winners were those who owned assets. The losers were those who only owned their labor. You won't believe the name of the single policy shift that set this machine into motion. And the receipt is wilder than you think. To understand why millennials live inside a loop of financial crises, we have to dissect the machine itself, the economic architecture that emerged after the 1970s. This shift wasn't random. It wasn't gradual. It was engineered through specific, deliberate changes to policy, banking, labor, housing, education, and global trade. These changes created a new economic paradigm, one that extracted wealth instead of distributing it, inflated asset prices instead of wages, and rewarded speculation instead of stability. This paradigm is what millennials inherited, and it explains why every crisis hits them with surgical precision. The single policy moment that detonated the system, the receipt you were promised, happened on August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. Overnight, the global financial system shifted from a monetary world with limits to one without a ceiling. Money was no longer tied to anything physical. It could now be created in any quantity at any time, through government policy or private banking decisions. This was the beginning of pure fiat capitalism, a system that derives power not from production, but from credit expansion. The ability to create money became concentrated in institutions, whose incentives revolved around profit, not public well-being. Once the dollar was fully detached from gold, a new economic model emerged, one based not on wages and productivity, but on leveraging debt to fuel growth. The shift wasn't immediately obvious, but its effects compound with time. As the decades passed, The real economy shrank in power, while the financial economy grew into the dominant force, shaping society. This is where millennials enter the story at the exact moment when this transformation had completed its takeover. To make sense of what millennials face, we must break down the mechanisms that define financialization today. Debt as an engine, assets as power, globalization as pressure, automation as replacement, education as a profit center, housing as a speculative market, work as a disposable resource. Each of these mechanisms evolved slowly, but by the time millennials reached adulthood, all of them were firmly in place. Consider the explosion of student loan debt. Prior to the 1980s, college was inexpensive because the government subsidized it heavily. But as federal and state support dwindled, universities began operating like private corporations while shifting cost onto students. Banks, recognizing a new profit stream, poured billions into student loan financing. In 1997, total student debt in the U.S. was roughly $30 billion. Today, it exceeds $1.7 trillion, a 5,566% increase. Millennials were the first generation fully trapped by the system. A student loan isn't just a bill. It's a chain that reshapes an entire life. It delays homeownership, retirement, marriage, parenthood, business creation. By the time millennials graduate, they start life in a financial hole that earlier generations never experienced. When you're starting point is debt, wealth becomes an uphill battle. Housing tells a similar story. This explains why millennials are the least likely generation in modern history to own a home. When assets inflate faster than wages, the door to ownership narrows until it's nearly shut. And once locked out of housing, millennials lose the primary mechanism through which middle-class families build wealth. Employment followed the same pattern. Stable, long-term jobs with pensions disappeared. Gig work replaced them. Contract labor replaced them. Benefits evaporated. Wage growth slowed. Millennials now earn 20% less than boomers did at the same age, even though they are more educated and more productive. Meanwhile, corporate profits soared to record highs. This divergence is not an accident, it is the defining feature of a financialized economy. When wages stagnate, but asset prices rise, wealth flows upward. Millennials, who entered the labor market after this transformation, were positioned at the bottom of a funnel designed to channel economic value away from workers and toward capital owners. The 2008 crisis exposed this dynamic like a flash of lightning illuminating the landscape. Millennials entering the workforce that year experienced a once-in-a-lifetime economic catastrophe. Except it wouldn't be the only one. Unemployment hit 10%, and for young workers it was closer to 18%. Entire industries collapsed. Graduates could not find work. Internships replaced full-time jobs. Remote and gig work exploded. Millennials watched wages fall while the cost of living continued to climb. Then something revealing happened. The government saved the financial institutions that created the crisis, but not the people affected by it. Banks received trillions in bailouts. Homeowners were foreclosed on by the millions. Asset prices soared once again. The wealth gap widened. This was the moment millennials realized the system was not built for them. But the cycle repeated again in 2020. During COVID-19, a global pandemic triggered a historic economic crash, and once again, millennials were the most exposed. Service sector jobs vanished overnight. Tech layoffs began soon after. Rent prices surged despite record unemployment. Inflation spiked to 40-year highs. And while the stock market recovered quickly thanks to unprecedented Federal Reserve intervention, wages lagged behind. Millennials lived through another crisis, another recovery that benefited the wealthy first, and another cycle of asset inflation that pushed homeownership even further out of reach. The reason this keeps happening lies in the design of the financial system itself. Corporations are incentivized to reduce labor cost. Banks are incentivized to expand credit. Investors are incentivized to inflate asset values. The government is incentivized to stimulate markets, not wages. Millennials exist at the intersection of all these forces. They are saddled with debt due to tuition inflation. They are priced out of housing due to speculative demand. They are underpaid due to labor market restructuring. They are threatened by automation due to technological acceleration. They are destabilized by globalization as jobs move overseas. They are replaced by AI at a faster rate than any generation before them. And unlike boomers who built wealth in an environment of rising wages, affordable homes, and broad economic stability, millennials must navigate a world where every advantage has been converted into a commodity. The final blow is the psychological shift. Millennials have spent their entire lives being told crisis is normal, instability is expected, and financial stress is personal failure instead of structural design. Their optimism has been replaced by cynicism. Their sense of security has been replaced by survival instincts. Their faith in institutions has been eroded by a lifetime of disappointment. This is the true cost of financialization, not just economic hardship, but cultural transformation. Millennials live in a world where the rules have changed, but the expectations placed on them have not. The system they inherited is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed, and the next crisis is already forming beneath the surface. By now, it's clear that millennials aren't merely unlucky. They are the first generation to come of age during the full maturity of a financial system, engineered for volatility, extraction, and consolidation. But the most unsettling truth is this: the crises millennials have lived through were until the end of the cycle, they were the beginning of something much larger. The global economy millennials are entering as adults is not the same one their parents entered. It isn't governed by stability. It isn't designed to reward long-term planning, loyalty, or linear career paths. Instead, it is built on rapid technological disruption, fragile supply chains, speculative investment models, digital monetization, and the concentration of wealth in fewer hands than at any point in modern history. Millennials are living in the first era, where a generation can do everything right and still watch the economic floor disappear. Beneath them, wages do not guarantee survival. Savings do not guarantee stability. Degrees do not guarantee employment. Hard work does not guarantee advancement. Homeownership does not guarantee security. The old rules no longer apply, yet millennials are still judged by them. This is why the stakes are so high. Millennials are reaching midlife, the point where previous generations were building wealth, buying homes, saving for retirement, and preparing to pass stability to their children. But instead, millennials are trapped between rising costs, stagnant wages, inflated asset prices, diminishing job security, and a world where every new technological breakthrough threatens the livelihoods they worked decades to establish. And the system is about to shift again. Artificial intelligence is accelerating at a speed that dwarfs the job displacement seen during the early 2000s automation wave. AI isn't replacing factory work, it's replacing the very jobs millennials were told to pursue: writing, marketing, analysis, programming, design, creative work, administrative work. For the first time, the safe jobs are no longer safe. Millennials are now watching AI erode the last economic promises they believed still existed. Meanwhile, inflation has eaten away at the little progress millennials managed to make after the COVID recession. In some major cities, rent has increased by more than 40% since 2020. Home prices have risen faster than wages by a factor of 5 to 1. Groceries now cost 20 to 40% more than they did just a few years ago. Childcare, healthcare, and transportation have all outpaced income growth. Millennials aren't living paycheck to paycheck because they're responsible. They're living paycheck to paycheck because the paycheck itself has been devalued while the cost of existence has skyrocketed. The worst part is that millennials were raised to believe they were the future, the generation that would change the world. And they have. They've redefined work culture, digital communication, social justice, entrepreneurship, and technology adoption. But the world they're living in is fundamentally different from the one they were prepared for. They are the first generation where adulthood did not follow a predictable sequence. Instead, every milestone has been replaced by crisis management. Graduate gives recession, find work gives layoffs, save money gives inflation, plan a future gives pandemic, rebuild. Savings gives housing crisis, start a family gives daycare crisis, develop a career gives AI disruption. It's not a timeline, it's a loop. And as if this weren't enough, millennials are also squeezed from above and below. They are supporting aging boomer parents while competing with Gen Z workers, who entered the market without the same economic hangover, unburdened by 2008, and armed with native digital instincts that businesses now value heavily. Economic pressure from older generations, competitive pressure from younger ones, technological pressure from AI, structural pressure from inflation, financial pressure from debt. This is the crucible millennials exist within. But here's the most important realization of all. If millennials fail economically, the entire global system fails with them. This is not a niche generational issue. Millennials are now the largest demographic in the workforce. They are the future tax base, the future home buyers, the future business owners, the future leaders. If they cannot afford homes, families, or long-term investments, the economy as a whole cannot sustain its aging population or maintain growth. Millennials aren't just the canaries in the coal mine, they're the coal mine itself. Their struggles signal the exhaustion of an economic model that can no longer sustain itself without constant crisis and intervention. The stakes are not just personal, they are civilizational. So here's the final question millennials must confront. Are they witnessing the temporary turbulence of a broken system, or the early stages of a new economic order being built on the ashes of the old one? History suggests the latter, and the decisions being made right now by governments, corporations, And technological forces will determine whether millennials become the generation that finally demands structural reform, or the generation that is permanently written off as collateral damage. The clock is ticking. The world is changing faster than any generation has ever experienced. And millennials are standing at the epicenter of that transformation. Before we close, tell me where you rate watching from this channel is built around the stories of people living through this moment. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden economic forces shaping your life, make sure you subscribe. Now, go watch the next video in this series, because if you want to understand what comes after the millennial crisis cycle, you need to understand the system that created it.